Hello, Kootenaygirl. Welcome back to the Wax Museum.
Yeah, hey John, how are you?
I am good. I'm trying to remember if I call you Kootenaygirl on the podcast or whether I use your first name all the time.
You can use my first name. Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
Marie.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. It's funny too when I have people on the podcast, they can go with John or Bridge. I don't care. Um,
Right.
it's funny because it's not even like a secret identity or anything like that. I just like my
Yeah.
public persona to be Bridge. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think
yeah,
that's cool.
yeah, I'm weird, but that's okay. So basically,
Hmm.
we got into a conversation on Twitter, where you were talking about Friday the 13th and why,
Hmm.
like talking about Friday the 13th being unlucky is a anti-feminist kind of trope.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'm just gonna I'll just
Yeah.
start like with
Yeah.
something.
Start.
How's that? So
Yeah.
like the even just the number 13 has so much superstition around it.
Yeah.
Um, that is, born out of a lot of religious fear. Um, And in like the esoteric world, Friday the 13th is it's a powerful day. Like Friday was a day known as if I remember right, it had something to do with love and abundance.
Huh.
And the number 13 was a symbol for the feminine or the goddess. Like there's women generally have 13 cycles in a year.
Oh, interesting.
Um, Yeah, yeah. And so it has this strong connection to the feminine.
Huh.
And if you look back, there's all this superstition that rises up around the number 13 for for just like really weird reasons. Like the number 12 seen as the perfect number of the divine.
Hmm.
There's 12 months in a year, 12
Yeah.
um we break our day up in things of 12, right? Like um and the number 13 after that was sort of seen like a, oh, you've gone beyond perfection. Now it's um what was the word for that? There was a word for that, but it was like 12 is divine and now you've gone beyond. It's like what Lucifer would do kind of thing.
Huh. Yeah, because
So
I
there's all
mean
this
that
meaning attached that, yeah.
well, it's interesting because I just feel like there's like a real strong connection between like sorcery and feminism, where like religion tends to equate feminism with sorcery. And it's like, and then satanic panic becomes something that's like, oh, look out for the feminists. And that's like, and I guess because
Right.
of the goddess worship, I guess historically,
Hmm.
but it's like the fear has created hate. And
Yeah.
that's, it's quite a phenomenon. Like, I don't think we talk about like enough about how fear leads to hate. And that's what we're seeing online mostly. Like, most of the hate that we see
Hmm.
online is rooted in fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of it is for sure. We tend to fear what we don't understand, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like, do you think like in Salem, like that was because they were feminists, they were strong women, that people were afraid of them, and that's why they attacked them?
Well, I think talking in general terms, like witch hunts and all that stuff around that was always kind of um, done to the poor people and the people who were like kind of outcasts or powerful women.
Hmm.
So um, I don't know a lot about
Yeah.
Salem. Like, obviously, there are some details we know, but I don't know a lot about it. And I'm not like the expert on witch trials by any
Yeah.
means or anything like that. But throughout history, we can see that women are always often labeled in a negative way when they're strong or they're knowledgeable.
Yeah.
I mean, women couldn't even be doctors up until not that long ago, right? Like, or they couldn't vote, or like
Yeah.
the feminine was seen as something that was imperfect and mysterious and scary. So it had to be demonized.
Huh. It's funny to me how like a lot of these like men who think that, like think in a complementarian way, um, it's they think they have a high view of masculinity and femininity, but it's like you're really diminishing both in saying, like
Totally.
women should not lead men. It's like why? Like it's a threat to men to have a woman leading,
Right.
or
Like,
she
what is it
loses her
about a
femininity.
woman that makes her so scary? Like,
Yeah.
uh, um, and I honestly think that it is. I mean, I could be really wrong and way off in left field here, but I think it's the man's desire to conquer the woman
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
like that sexual drive, right? Of like, I want to own you kind of thing. I
Well,
want
and
to
that's sexual
consume
drive
you.
too. Like I really think that for a lot of men, um, it's that orgasm acts kind of like a pacifier for them.
Yeah.
And so that's why
Yep.
men are addicted to sex or addicted to porn, is that they need the orgasm because they can't cope emotionally. And it's like
Hmm.
putting a soother in a baby's mouth. Like that's it. And so
Hmm.
I'm like, these guys are so they pretend to be strong, but the guys that speak the loudest about masculinity are very, very weak men.
It would seem so. They're very afraid. Yep.
So, I mean, there was a scripture that I came across in Exodus. Apparently, there's a
Hmm.
lot of scriptures about sorcery, but
Yep.
I was just Googling it. I'm like, oh, it's Exodus 22. But what struck me about this particular passage is it said, do not permit a sorceress to live. And it was
Hmm.
just interesting to me that it didn't say sorcerer, it just said
Hmm.
sorceress.
Hmm.
And and I posted about it on Facebook. And of course, my Facebook demographic, one of them like
Yeah.
replied with like, just read a commentary and move on. And I was like, this just doesn't sit right with me. And I'm okay with
Hmm.
that not sitting right with me. I'm not going to try to figure out how to explain away the passage. But
Hmm.
I guess when we talk about like ancient thought, I
Hmm.
think it's again kind of that powerful women are scary.
Yeah. Well, in a patriarchal culture, for sure, because men are supposed to hold the power. Men are supposed to hold the wisdom. Men, it's all about men. Women are just there to
Yeah.
have babies and serve men.
Well, and that's, I mean, and that's a fascinating thing too, is like how like marriage kind of arose, like the concept of marriage arose out of this, like,
Hmm.
keeping your property. And like
Yeah.
then when you have your children, they're also part of your property. And it's like if we allow promiscuity, then I don't know if I own those children, right?
That's right. Yep.
And so like it makes for an argument, for like ethical polyamory in current culture,
Mm.
because it's like
Hmm.
before it was like the commitment of marriage was all about property. And we
Yeah.
still kind of hold to that. And I know it works for some people, but
Hmm.
it's kind of interesting, like this concept that like um not all my needs are going to be fulfilled by one person. And it's possible
Hmm.
that all my sexual needs will be fulfilled by one person. So we don't even need to go
Hmm.
there so much, is like, well, there's not that one person, my partner's not going to supply all of my needs. And so you
Hmm.
find other people that can supply the rest of your needs. And
Right.
I think when we have kind of that property mentality, it's like, well, that's not allowed. You're now being unfaithful.
Right. Yeah, that's a whole huge can of worms to unpack. Like I think that um if you've never heard of polyamory or open marriages or ethical non-monogamy, just even hearing that concept would be so startling to you that
Yeah.
it'd be hard to learn about it, right? in that moment. But I have friends who are into that, and I've done reading and research. And just like in monogamy, there's going to be issues
Yeah.
in polyamory. In any
Yeah.
way you do relationship, you're going to find issues with it. Um, but when it comes down to property, knowing the boundaries of like, this is me, these are my emotions, this is my stuff, and not putting it on other people, that becomes actually a lot more clear in open style relationships, which is
Huh.
really interesting.
That is really interesting. I guess you don't have that
Mhm.
structure and you got more leeway to be real.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess the other thing that struck me, another scriptural passage that was bothering me, and it was actually the words of Jesus, which I'm like, it's so funny because it's like, I
Mm.
disagree with Jesus on this right now. Um, and it was talking about like the one where it talks about like divorce only for marital unfaithfulness.
Hmm.
And I mean, that clearly there's a problem right there because it's like it doesn't talk about abuse. But then he
Hmm.
said, whoever marries a divorced woman commits
Hmm.
adultery. And it's like
Hmm.
engendered language. And I mean, it could be the translation too, but I'm just like, it just looks like Jesus is a product of his time because it's again that
Yeah.
kind of property thing where it's like, well, now that you've had sex with someone else's property,
Hmm.
you
Right.
broke the law, right? And so I
Yeah.
mean, kind of stepping away from that and just being like, wow, like kind of this mentality, like there's patriarchy kind of that's so prevalent through all of it.
Hmm.
And it's crazy to me that like if we can use the religious text to liberate
Hmm.
people, I think it can be a helpful
Hmm.
thing. But if we're using it to, ensnare or
Hmm.
encage people, it's like that's why are we doing
Yeah.
this?
Yeah. And I think when it really comes down to it, everything, when I was an evangelical, I would always say like everything should be seen through the lens of scripture.
Yeah.
Like we got
Yeah.
to filter it all through the lens of scripture.
Yeah.
And I laugh now because one, that's just so cringy and it's
Yeah.
just so close-minded. But two, I think now that everything should be seen through the lens of consent,
Yeah.
enthusiastic consent.
Yeah.
And that opens up a whole wide array of different things. What does enthusiastic consent mean? That puts the onus on you to make sure that you are not being a passive observer in your life, but an active participant, learning and researching, and not just being spoon fed that this is what you need to believe, but it's actually going out and saying this, figuring it out for yourself, that kind of thing. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. No, totally. And I remember the first
Mm-hmm.
time you brought that thought to me, I was like, I had to really like try to understand it and see, okay, like your whole like when you were talking about I would like to have a church that's all about consent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like thinking, well, does that work? And the more I've thought about it, like I've been finding theology that
Mm-hmm.
lines up with that. And when you talk about like open and relational theology, and it was
Mm-hmm.
like Thomas J. Ord
Mm.
and yeah, and so we have that like there's a couple authors I've had that have talked about that, and it's just stumbled upon these people. And
Cool.
um yeah, and it's interesting. And then like my church that I go to, it's very progressive. It's the Road Church in Calgary.
Mm.
And my
Okay.
pastor was talking about the names of God. And
Mm-hmm.
so she talked about like how whenever the Bible says God, like the capital G God, it's the
Mm-hmm.
word Elohim. And the word
Mm-hmm.
Elohim just means generic God. Like it's not a specific God. And then
Mm-hmm.
the other thing is like in the NIV, they have like Lord in all caps. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's poorly translated because we always think of that as like a title, when in reality,
Mm-hmm.
the word Lord is actually for Yahweh. We basically translated the
Mm.
word Yahweh into Lord, which I actually as a side, using that word um, is like offensive to the Jewish people because they're not
Right.
allowed to say it. And there's actually a song by Michael Gungor on his new album where they
Okay.
say yeah, hey, because they didn't want to say the other word, which I already used.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
anyways, they moved from using that the Y word
Mm,
to Adonai. And so basically, Lord is
mm,
actually Adonai would be a more accurate translation because it's like
hmm.
this is the name of that God. Just like I know that you're Marie and you know that I'm John. It's like as soon as we
Right.
assign a name to someone, they're not a thing anymore. They're actually a person that we can interact with,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And so when you look at like the NIV and how many times it's got all caps Lord, which I need to go and read it now and say that's Adonai. That's not, it's not a hierarchical thing. It's like actually knowing that God of consent. Um, I think that's quite a mind shift because it's like we in Western culture thrive on hierarchy. We want hierarchy to everything.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
that's, more than anything, it's like learning that, you know, if there is a God, that God is, you know, partnering with us in creation. It's not
Mm.
that this God is hierarchical and will, it's like love. God is love. And it's like love is not coercive, but
Right.
like kind of the evangelical God is coercive. And it's kind of like, well, there's
Yeah.
always that threat of hell. And
Hmm.
there's kind of like, like Jonah and how Jonah, didn't want to go do the thing to go tell those people they're
Yeah.
all going to get wrecked. And then he ends up
Right.
in the belly of a fish. And eventually he gets forced to do the will of God. And it's like, what a beautiful story. And it's like, I don't know. Like I don't know what to do with much of the Old Testament because I'm like, well, that doesn't
Mm.
really line up with what I know of the God that's personal to me. Um,
Hmm.
but
Right.
and then I think when we talk about like these kind of witch passages, it's
Hmm.
like it's so poorly used. And what I see is like when you got like Sam Smith doing that performance wearing devil horns, and there's like
Hmm.
kind of this satanic panic that's happening, and people are like they're
Hmm.
trying to convert our kids to Satanism and all this stuff. And it's like, man, have you heard some of the songs that Sam Smith has written? Like, like
Yeah.
a song about like, has it ever hurt you to look in the mirror?
Mm.
Is one of the
Right.
songs and learning to love themselves, right? And I'm just like, it's
Yeah.
so beautiful. And it's like, what a beautiful human being. And it's like,
Yeah.
put on some devil horns, and everyone's like, oh, you're an evil human being. And I'm like, what I find is the people that speak the most on what is satanic have
Hmm.
the highest propensity to dehumanize other human beings.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
so if there is something that's satanic to me, to look at a human being and not see them as a human being is the most
Hmm.
satanic thing I can think of. And that's
Hmm.
what I see from the satanic panic people. It's like they will
It's like the
dehumanize
ultimate
Sam Smith,
projection.
the ultimate projection.
It's
Yeah.
the ultimate projection. They're so fearful that they got to find the other and they got to find the demon in the other because they don't want to look in themselves. They don't want to look at the religion they follow that wants to colonize and control people.
Yeah. Well, and the colonization, I mean, this is like, it's just blowing my mind because I really like, deconstructed my faith. And I was like, this just doesn't make
Mm.
sense.
Hmm.
It's like I'm seeing the next generation wants nothing to do with the church. And I'm like, why is that? And it's like, well,
Hmm.
the church is a worse environment than the rest of the world. And it's like,
Yeah,
and
in
why
some
is
ways.
that? And every time I talk to
Yeah.
people in the church, they're just kind of like, well, there's bad people everywhere. I'm like, no, there's worse people in the church. And you guys fail to recognize that. And
Yep.
so when you talk about like colonization, I was actually invited to go to like a lecture by William
Mm.
Jenkins. I think no, William
Okay.
Jennings. William Jennings. And he's like a African American Baptist
Mm.
pastor. Um,
Okay.
and he talked about how like when Jesus was little,
Mm,
there had to be a moment where Mary just like took his hand and touched a plant,
mm,
and taught him what a plant is. And all of these things, like Jesus learned from Mary. And even the stories that he told when he was sharing his parables, it's like those stories probably came from his mother, right? Like he
mm-hmm.
probably learned so many things from his mother, which
Yeah.
is indicative that God can learn from us.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Good
he used
point.
that as kind of an argument to get away from colonization, because it's like colonization is like God knows everything. I've learned from God, therefore I now know everything. So shut up
Mm-hmm.
and listen. As
Exactly.
opposed to, well, my God learns from us, therefore I need to learn from you. And I think if we're going to
Uh-huh.
deconstruct colonization, it's like we could actually actively learn from each other. I can actively learn from Sam Smith, because the fact that he
Yeah.
says, and I can't even remember the lyrics, but I'm like, it's like, have you ever been like just devastated when you look in the mirror? I'm like, that's so
Yeah.
incredible that Sam's able to learn that, and then wears weird
Mm-hmm.
outfits and all these people get outraged towards them. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just like, this is so interesting, because it's like you guys are continuously trying to bully this person
Yeah.
because of your whatever it is. Like there's just this supremacy that you think everybody's got to fit what your
Right.
gender ideal is. And like when you talk about when they call it gender ideology, I'm like, they're the ones with the gender ideology.
That's right. We've been watching cross dressers forever. Bugs
Yeah.
Bunny and Elmer Fudd got married, man. Like
Yeah.
Bugs Bunny was always in a dress. Like
Yeah.
it the there's no big deal.
Yeah.
Like it's no big deal. The only reason why drag queens are a big deal today is because it's men dressing up as women,
Yeah.
and it's degrading for a man to do that. But it's not for a woman to dress as a man
Yeah.
because they're punching upwards, right?
Yeah. It's an upgrade. But it's
Right.
like it's so funny
It's
because it's like
silly.
they pretend to have this high view of masculinity, but they're like masculinity is threatened by so many little things.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
what if masculinity is just whatever you decide it to be? What if femininity is whatever you decide it to be? Like why does any of this matter? I am
Right.
just increasingly frustrated with how like gender has become such a political issue.
Hmm.
I'm like, just let people be who they are.
Yeah. And I think I think part of that's insecurity is that people have been so taught to find themselves in their religion,
Yeah.
in these ideas that they don't actually know who they are.
Yeah.
And for me, that journey this last as I've been deconstructing and even in just the last few months has gone really deep into my soul. Like, who are you?
Hmm.
And as I'm discovering that more and more and becoming okay with that, my boundaries are becoming clear. And there's like a fog that's lifting from me that I can see who I am and I understand what I need. And I'm
Hmm.
okay with that. And I don't need other people to tell me what I need. I know what my system needs. So as we look outside and everyone's saying you need to be this way, you need to do this, this is how you dress, that's you're like men shouldn't do that. Like that's all coming from this place of like, I don't know who I am. I need these
Yeah.
black and white things to slot in everything so it feels safe, it feels good, and I know my spot because I don't actually know who I am.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And I think like for me, I think recognizing that, I used to have a problem with effeminate men, you know?
Mm,
And I think what
mm,
it was rooted in is I was told I couldn't be that.
yeah.
And I worked really hard to not be that. And
Wow.
so Yeah. And so it's like, it's just interesting because I'm like, okay, well, I can challenge that now. I'm okay
Yeah.
with if something I do or say looks effeminate and people get angry about it. That is hilarious to me. I, I
Yeah.
think it's like
Yeah.
Kurt Cobain wearing a dress. He was like, I wear a
Right.
dress around the house because it's comfortable and it pisses people off.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's so
Right.
funny how like being okay with being effeminate can be the most punk rock thing you can do, which in a
Yeah.
way seems really masculine to me. Like that seems like masculine energy to be like, I'm gonna wear a dress that's gonna piss people off.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like we have the two labels, and it's so that we can understand certain, like the yin and
Yeah,
then the yang and all those things. Like labels can be okay. They're just a form of describing what's going on. But
yeah,
when we say that, like, you can't express that label, like if you're a man and you're crying, there's
yeah,
what's wrong with you? Like when we
yeah,
start to say that, we start to cut people off. Like we start to cut parts of them out and say,
yeah,
this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. This is how you have to be. And so when we see like this whole uproar about drag queens and
yeah,
LGBTQ people, like, and being so judgmental about how they show up in life, they just, the other people, there's an insecurity, there's a not knowing who you are, there's this fear of life in general in what is moral and good. And they want to take these other people and just like basically cut them up into the small thing of like, okay, that's okay now.
yeah,
Now how you express in a human body is okay.
yeah.
Like it we're we're one being, but in we're multiple people. We
Hmm.
have multiple parts. We have, and like that's the thing of IFS, internal family systems. We have a core self, and then we have all these other parts inside of us. And when we cut those parts off and ignore them or berate them or become ashamed of them, we bury them, but they remain and they will call out in pain until they're validated and acknowledged and embraced and loved. And that's the same thing we see happening in society.
Hmm.
We're saying to certain people, you're unacceptable, you're gross, you're immoral, all about people who are living within the boundaries of enthusiastic consent.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, those same people pointing fingers are covering up child sexual abuse in the church,
Yeah.
are quiet about other forms of abuse that happen because they need to wear their mask. So we have to learn to embrace all the parts in ourselves, but then embrace that people around us who aren't causing harm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think the hard thing too is like how to deal with those people who cause harm. Because
Mhm.
like right now, I'm still kind of in the process of ejecting those people.
Mhm.
Because I'm like, I just don't have space to deal with their bullshit, for
Yeah.
lack of better terms. I'm like,
Yeah.
I've got enough drama in my life right now. I don't need somebody who's
Yeah.
debating, what I'm going through, what I'm
Right.
experiencing right now. They're debating it as if it's a theoretical thing because it is
Yeah.
theoretical to them. And there's just no concept of like, I don't need to speak on this
Yeah.
because they
Yeah.
feel like they have the right to speak on everything. And it's
Right.
like, okay, well, you can speak on anything, but go do it in that corner.
Right. Go
Nowhere
go
near
do it on
me.
someone else's timeline. Like,
Yeah.
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 And it's like, it's not that I hate those people, but I think
Of
that
course
they
not.
are, really, they're part of a system and there's a system that's making them that way. And I guess what's really interesting is like when we talk about like gender and sexuality, they're more concerned about fighting, this
Mhm.
system. Like they're trying to fight a system all the time and they don't see
Mhm.
the individuals that they're hurting. They
Yeah.
fail to like they refuse to recognize that there's individuals they're hurting by fighting against,
Yeah.
anti-racism, you know,
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ rights. They're like they have this fear, I guess, that these agendas are going to change their world and the
Right.
world of their children. And it's like, so you're preemptively attacking all of the
Mm-hmm.
progress we're trying to make on these things in the name of like, well, I don't want the world to change for my children.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if the world changes around them, then they have to change,
Yeah.
right? Like they
Yeah.
have to make some changes.
Well, and I mean, that's the part too, like when you talk about like, our God never changes. I'm like, the people that find comfort in that, I just find it so weird because I'm like,
Mm.
and I like, what is it, Pope Francis talking to Pope Benedict
Mm-hmm.
in the
Mm-hmm.
movie The Two Popes, and he's like, yes, God
Mm.
does change. He moves closer to us. And I was
Ah.
like, I like that concept better. And I'm like, yeah, I think, I guess for me, more than anything, it's like my theology has become utilitarian, where I'm like, well, does this
Mm.
make my world more loving? If it doesn't make my world more
Yeah.
loving, I see no reason to embrace any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of
Yep.
people kind of have this like, well, the Bible says that God is all of these things. Therefore, we
Mm-hmm.
have to decide that love is all of these things. And it's like, okay, well, that's not really love, though. It's like you guys are being gaslit into believing that manipulation is love. And
Right. Yes. When I was first deconstructing, I really appreciated the podcast, The Bible for Normal People, Pete
yeah,
Enns and Jared
yeah,
Bias. Like that was actually super transformative for me. And when I started to understand that the Bible is a book of stories written about God from
yeah,
people's perspective.
yeah,
It's not that God came down and wrote, this is it. It's people experiencing what they feel is God, and they wrote it down in a book. And we can go to all kinds of sources for other divine inspiration, like
yeah,
how we experience God in the day to day. We can get inspiration from a song, right? Like you were talking about Sam Smith's song. We can get inspiration from a poem. We can get inspiration from a bird in a tree. Like there's so much what some people will call divine inspiration out there that to relegate it to this one book requires then to 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 join a war to destroy all else outside of that book.
yeah. Yeah, and I like Keith Giles, who I've had on the podcast several times now. Um
Mm,
I think it's in Sola Mysterium, and I always get the title wrong. But anyways, he was talking about how like the Bible says that all scripture is good for building up or whatever it
mhm.
says. Man, I'm
Reproof.
such a good scholar. Yeah. But he said that the word scripture doesn't actually mean the canon, the biblical canon.
Mm,
He believes that
right.
scripture means all God breathed words, which could be in
Mm,
songs, in you know,
yeah.
books, in movies that you watch, like all of that. How do we know it's God
Yeah.
inspired? We can tell.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's
Because it
so
connects
beautiful.
with your spirit. It connects with soul.
All right, here's the lyrics. I actually found the lyrics.
Okay.
Have you ever felt like being someone else, feeling like the mirror isn't good for your health? Every
Mhm.
day I'm trying not to hate myself, but lately it's not hurting like it did before. Maybe I
Mm,
am learning how to love me more.
beautiful. That's
That's
beautiful.
satanic. I'm in.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm like,
And
it's
here's
just
an interest
so beautiful. And I like,
here.
we have all these people who are like finally getting comfortable with who they are. And we got the religious
Yep.
people coming along and saying, no.
Of course. Of course, because it upsets their system.
Yeah.
Doesn't fit in their twelve commands.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing in the whole satanic panic of the 80s, um, was there was like thousands of allegations of like child abuse, sacrifice, torture, and in all the investigating the police ever did on all of those cases, not one came to fruition.
Hmm.
Nothing. Like, and so even in that, like religious fanatics and conspiracists, whatever you would
Yeah.
call them, they grab on to these things, and like promote it like the snowball effect, and they get really, really big. And we see that now with QAnon. It's the
Yeah.
same thing. It was the
Yeah.
same thing about like Pizzagate and and the
Yeah.
vaccines, and you can see the Republicans just like, oh my gosh, talking about lizard people and like
Yeah.
like it's wild.
It is. And
And
I
it's
think
not based in anything.
what's really crazy too is that you've got then these like religious institutions that become so big and powerful, and they're like, we're doing so much good. We're doing so much good. And I think it's because they think that they're giving people personal salvation, and that's what the good is that they're doing. And
Hmm.
so when someone comes forward with some allegations, they're like, oh, no, no, no. Because if that gets out, all the good we're doing will go away, and all these people will stop believing
Exactly.
in God, and they'll all go to hell. So, you know what? We're just going to let this go. And they
Hmm.
think they're doing the right thing. Like they really genuinely believe they're doing the right thing, but not letting this stuff get
Yeah.
out. And I think
Yeah.
the most telling thing was like in the Hillsong documentary. I don't know if you saw it,
Yeah.
but
I
there's
haven't seen it.
that guy who was uh Brian Houston's father had
Mm,
molested this kid, and then the kid grew
mm.
up, and the kid's like bringing forward these allegations, and Houston's father says, I am close to death now. Like, can I just give you $100,000 and you can forgive me because I need to get right with God?
Oh,
And I'm like, wow, like, whoa. And it was funny because it was like right after that, I listened to that song Just Between You and Me by DC Talk.
oh,
And I was
okay. Yeah.
like, and there's that bridge where it basically says, um, before I approach the throne, like I need to get my shit right with you because God's gonna
Hmm.
be pissed and I can't be close to God if I don't get shit right with you. And I'm like, this whole mentality that it's like, but I gotta make things right because God. And it's not,
Hmm.
I gotta make things right because I screwed you over. Like I did this
Bingo.
horrible thing to you. I wrecked your life. And I'm like,
Bingo.
this needs to like
It's
I need to come clean about
self-centered.
this for the sake of you because I did this horrible thing to you.
Exactly.
But it's like, and so like this is where I maybe the belief of in God is such a detrimental thing for these people because they think they're
Hmm.
answering to a higher power, and therefore what we
Hmm.
do to these people doesn't matter because I'm still serving
Yeah.
this higher power.
Right. And it completely invalidate those people's experience.
Yeah,
I mean, think about how it feels to be invalidated. It's awful.
yeah,
And then if you've had trauma, if you've experienced trauma, whatever kind of trauma, and you're continually invalidated about it,
yeah,
that person who is invalidating you, you're going to want to get as far away from them as possible. And so then they're telling you they're invalidating you because of their faith in God.
yeah,
Well, um, what? Like, how's
yeah,
that going to work? You know what I'm saying? Like, you're
yeah,
not drawing
totally.
people into connection, you're cutting them off, and you're saying that they aren't important. How you feel is so there's you're the abuser or whatever is centering their own experience,
Yeah, yeah,
and the
yeah,
victim and the one who's hurt carries the burden still,
yeah,
and that's gross.
yeah,
That's just gross.
totally. Totally. And I think
Like
that's kind
the
of
say
how people are
the
dealing
saying
with.
The saying you cannot heal an environment you're still triggered in is
Yeah.
very true.
Yep.
It's very true. And so that's why people are leaving the church.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're leaving those environments because it's a place often of invalidation, of gaslighting, of the lines of consent are constantly crossed.
Yeah.
Like people go to the prayer corner and immediately the prayer warriors think that they can just lay hands and do whatever they want. But for some people, that's traumatic to
Yeah.
go and experience that, right? Like, so this environment where there's no boundaries because God,
Yeah.
and crossing people's boundaries all the time, not understanding consent whatsoever, is an environment that hurts people,
Yeah. Well, and that's,
all in the name of God.
I saw an atheist posting about like, if God doesn't make himself completely evident to me, I mean, it's like
Mhm.
unfair for him to penalize me for not knowing him. And I'm
Yeah.
like, you know what? And I kind of replied to them. I was like, if God is love, love will beckon you. Whatever that looks like, whether you believe in God or not, like love's gonna beckon
Hmm.
you. And
Hmm.
that's it. Like that's the whole thing. Like I'm like, there are people who are highly religious, very Christian, and their God is not love. And
Right.
and
But the
that,
atheist had a point. He has a point. He or
yeah,
she, whatever it was, has
yeah,
a point though that if this God that
yeah,
Christians, Muslim, whoever believes in so much is so big and so powerful and so important, this God would be so much more obvious to so many people.
yeah.
And
Well,
it's
and I mean,
not.
and the like, I haven't had a reason to believe in you, and now you're gonna penalize me for it. And I'm like,
Exactly.
I don't think God does. Like that's ridiculous. Like that
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to me. Um,
No.
and I think it's like that's love beckoning us. We're all beckoned to love. And you can choose
Yeah.
not to follow love's beckoning. And that
Yeah.
leads to a shitty life.
Hmm.
Right? It's like if you don't choose love, you're not going to have a good life. And I think it's as simple as that. And so, whether people are with religion or without religion, if they're not choosing love, they're not really choosing
Hmm.
life. And
Hmm.
I don't want belief or disbelief to get in the way of just simply loving people and trying to understand them.
Hmm.
And we just got all
Yeah.
these systems that are getting in the way of people
Hmm.
understanding and
Yeah.
loving.
Yeah.
And I
And
guess more than,
let's not judge those who have been really hurt by systems
yeah,
claim to be love
yeah,
and weren't. And so because they've been shown such a shitty example of love, they have a hard time being vulnerable and present with people. And so
yeah,
on the outside, those people can look like maybe they don't have a great life or maybe but to them their life is just fine. They feel safe and secure however they've built their life.
that's an interesting
So
point. Yeah, they've set
there's
boundaries. Those are the boundaries they needed to set.
that's right.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah. It's the
yeah,
idea of some people have a really hard time with God being male
yeah,
because their dad was a really shit parent
yeah,
and abused them,
yeah,
right? So they'll go towards more the feminine and the goddess.
yeah.
And that's all for protection. It's all to protect themselves. And that's how our systems are designed. That's how we evolved, is because we're human beings who have an external and an internal system that simply wants to protect us. We want to show up in our lives as best as we can, and we want to protect ourselves. And some people have had really, really hard lives, and they're going to be more protective than others. And that's okay.
Do you think there are people within like just traditional evangelicalism that are just doing fine?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
probably. yeah, I'm sure there's lots of them that are just vibing out and enjoying their lives, and because they've created this framework to live within, and they stay within that bound. And
Yeah.
as long as they're within those bounds, they're happy and
Yeah.
they don't question. If doubts come up for whatever reason, they don't look at them. Whatever. They've created their life in that way because it feels safe to them. And so in some ways, I can't look back on my life and be too upset about where I come from and
Yeah.
how fundamentalist I was, because at the time it felt really safe for me. And it's what I understood was safe. Now, when those boundaries become boundaries I expect other people to live by, that's where we go wrong.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
and when I look back, yep, I did that. I
Mm.
thought that, I lived that way, and I'm not proud of it. But I grew past it.
Yeah.
I grew beyond it. And that's what's good. It's when we're growing forward and we're moving forward and we're learning and we're not shut off.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess and that's I guess where I'm at is like, can I just let people be? You
Mm,
know? Like do they don't need
yeah.
to go to where I went because where I'm at is stupid complicated. Like it's
Hmm.
right? It's like
Yeah.
there's just a lot of complications. I understand the simplicity of like it's almost like staying in the boat instead of
Right.
trying to walk on water. Because it's like,
Right.
yeah,
Yep.
I'm drowning sometimes.
Yeah.
And that sucks.
We're all, yeah. Yeah. We're all just doing our best.
Yeah,
And that's where the boundaries thing come in, right? That's where the boundaries, we set our boundaries. And like some people cannot come within our circle because
yeah,
they hurt us.
yeah.
And it's too traumatic to have those people in our lives anymore. And that's okay because that's your system.
And I think some of those people we do have in our lives, there's just certainly conversations that aren't going to happen. You
True.
know, it's like they
Yeah.
bring up the topic, and I'll just be like, yeah, I'm not talking about this. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Or you can sit and just ask them questions
Yeah, that's true.
and just be curious with them and explore with them their inside ideologies and why they believe that way and what that
Yeah.
does for them. And
Yeah.
that's a really interesting posture to take. And that's what I've
Yeah.
learned from life coaching the most is that
That's beautiful.
you you just take that posture of staying curious, right?
Yeah.
And figuring out like what's that about for you? Like let's explore
That's
that a little bit. And,
so interesting too, because I remember I used to listen to this podcast. It was all like apologetics.
mhm,
Um, it's now called Wise Disciple, and I haven't listened to it forever. I can't remember what it was
mm,
called before, but they renamed
okay.
it anyways. And he called it First Date Evangelism. And it's where you just like act
Oh,
like it's a first date and you yeah, not first aid, first date. Where you
uh-huh.
ask questions to get to know the person.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, for us that are, you know, kind of at a different place with our faith, it's like we can still ask those questions of people who are still very much part of
Mhm.
that umbrella. Um,
Yeah.
but what I think is really interesting too, because like what really shocked me about COVID was just how much disinformation
Mm,
people were coming with. And me
yeah.
like having a job kind of on the health end of things, I was like,
Mm,
I can't even do the math of what you're talking about here. Like, if the CDC is lying about all this stuff, like all of my work is a lie. Like,
right.
because a lot of my work
Right.
involves, you know, the same
Yeah.
science and the same
Yep.
experts, right? And so I'm like, I can't
Yep.
even, but you'd find, you know, like you start talking to people about like natural immunity and how that works and everything. And how we
Hmm.
spend way more time indoors than we should as animals. And,
Hmm.
you know, you look at all
Hmm.
that stuff and it's like, okay, well, I could try to refute every argument you have about
Yeah.
how the Chinese government is involved. I'm like, I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and figure all this out and do my own research too. Like, I pay
Yeah.
people to do that through
Yeah.
my tax money. But
Right.
what I found really interesting, I'm like reading this, or I was doing this audiobook. The what is it? The Persuaders. And they
Mm.
were talking about building immunity to disinformation, and how
Mm.
like instead of like trying to refute every bad argument with good
Right.
information, which we know
Right.
doesn't work, we tried it. What
Mm-hmm.
they're saying is like you actually help someone recognize what disinformation looks like, or what kind of incentives these
Mm-hmm.
people have to deceive you. And if you're able to do that, you're basically cutting it off at the source, and that person
Yeah.
develops immunity to all these bad ideas. And so, and I think like part of it is just understanding people's incentive. Like, who has incentive to
Mm-hmm.
lie right now about things, right?
Right.
And
Right.
it's like, and everybody does have incentive to lie about things. Um, so it's just like if we just kind of assume there's a potential for somebody to deceive us, then we think, well, in what way are they trying to deceive us? Right? Like, I mean, you
And
look
to
at someone
what
like,
end?
yeah,
And to what end?
well,
Like
you look
what's the end game here?
yeah, because I mean, you look at someone like Matt Walsh, and it's like he clearly just
Mm-hmm.
wants to shock people. Like that's his whole brand. He's just going to continue to shock people. Someone's going to rage, and then he's going to talk about that rage, and that's just all he does. So the
Right.
bulk of what he does is nonsense. Like it's like there's
Yeah.
no, he's just trying to figure out the way to piss people off.
It's like
And
Fox News.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, and so, and I mean, like, it's pretty, I think, like our national broadcaster has like good reason really to attack the conservatives, because the conservatives are always trying to defund them, and they will
Mm-hmm.
prop up the liberal government because the liberal government will always fund them, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
but I always find like if they have any kind of negative reporting on the liberals, I'm like, you can bet it's true, because they're not
Right.
incentivized to make up bad stories about the liberals.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Right.
And so I mean, like, we have to see the world that way and
Mm-hmm.
understand, what are people's incentives to go too far. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and we know it too when we talk to evangelical Christians, because they're always going to have an incentive to hold to
Mm-hmm.
whatever the Bible says.
Yep. It comes down to power, really. I think in most of the situations and circumstances, it's just power. People want power. People want the glory to know they've got the right story, or we're on the in crowd. We know the real truth. Like
Yeah, that's
yeah.
that's a really interesting one with like conspiracy theorists, is like they have this like,
Hmm.
I have this special knowledge and that makes me special.
Yeah. And that's
And
not a new thing. That goes back to ancient days of like the Gnostics, the secret knowledge, the mystics. Like this isn't a new thing. It's
yeah.
been around forever.
Well, and I guess so. I mean, like for you,
Hmm.
what really drives you in what you do? So I don't think
Oh,
this is
that's a good
about power
question.
for you.
No, I want to live my life
Uh-huh.
on my terms.
Mm-hmm.
Like I want to own my own power. Okay. So I want to live life on my own terms. And I want people to know they can do that too.
Hmm.
And so it's not like a trying to gather power to myself. I'm like, okay, we each have our own power to live in, embrace it. Like, you don't have to embrace my power, that's mine. You have your own. You have your
Hmm.
own ability to make choices and create and heal and help the world in how you show up in it. And that all comes from inside. It all comes from inside. It's nothing outside of you. And so, as I have deconstructed and unhooked from religion and started to stand on my own and discover my own ideas and who I am, man, it's liberating and it's super frustrating at the same time because I can see where I want to go. And but I don't know where my path is, how I'm gonna get there. Do you know what I'm
Uh,
saying? Like I can see that it's about the journey. It's not about getting there. Um, but it is about honoring who I am. And I think that that is something for everybody to know and claim that power that they have within and to honor themselves, and that's a lot of work. That takes a lot of work. That takes therapy. That takes a lot of shadow work, owning your shit, like
yeah.
working through your trauma, putting up your boundaries, and celebrating the things that turn your lights on
Hmm.
because everybody's different. I mean, we're both in the heart center of the Enneagram. I'm a 2, you're a 4,
Yeah.
and we're very feeling oriented,
Yeah.
right? And then there's the head center and the body center. Well, as humans, we need to embrace all three and learn to walk in all three in our journey. And that requires community, it requires partners to co-regulate with, and it requires us to show up authentically. And when we can't embrace ourselves, embrace the beautiful system that we have within that we ourselves have created to protect ourselves, we just get lost. We just get lost amongst the world, and our energy gets hidden. There you
I
go.
think, yeah, no, that's awesome. I think like maybe that's where I'm at right now is I'm learning my power
Mm,
because I've got like big things
beautiful.
coming up and I'm
Hmm.
just like, okay. And learning, how to express myself and not worry about how people are going to react because I think
Yes.
growing up and feeling like I have to be the peacemaker in every situation,
Mm,
it's
mm,
like, you know, the last thing I think about is how do I feel about that? And I think part of
yeah.
it is masculinity too, right? Because it's like, well,
Mm,
you can't let your feelings overrule everything. And so
hmm.
I kind of like started hiding in empathy,
Mm,
and like I have
right.
empathy for others and I'm swimming in their emotions. And then I talk to my
Hmm.
therapist and my therapist is like, you know that knowing other people's emotions is something your imagination does, right? And I'm like, damn, that's like my whole identity is that I know how other people are feeling. And it's all imaginary, seriously, but it's beautiful because it like helps me understand that I don't have to do that. Right? Like it's good to
Hmm.
have kind of a hypothesis of how people are feeling. And I like part of me wanted to defend it because
Mm,
I'm like, no, I ask people and then I figure it out. I'm not just guessing. Like I actually ask them about how they're feeling, but it's like, but I'm not really feeling what they're feeling. Like there's no way
hmm.
I can be feeling
Hmm.
exactly what they're feeling. And so maybe that's the other stage of deconstruction is like understanding that it's like, okay, I don't totally feel what they're feeling and I need to figure out what I'm feeling
Hmm. Yeah.
and express it and not worry about how that affects things. It's
Right.
almost
Express
like
it in healthy ways. But there is a place for empathy though,
there
because
is.
empathy helps us validate
Yeah.
people, because it
Yeah.
helps us put that pause between our listening and our judgment,
Yeah.
right? So the empathy, we don't take on the emotion, but we try to understand the experience so we can see how we would feel
Yeah.
in that. We can't know how they do, but it gives us a tool to help validate people and see people. And that's
Yeah.
important.
It
But
is.
then the boundaries, right? Boundaries like this is
Well,
mine, that's
it's
yours.
being able to see people, which I think I'm really good at, but I don't see myself. And
Mm.
so I'm
Are
learning
you
to
sure
see
you're not an
myself.
Enneagram 9?
Which one's Enneagram 9?
They're the peacemaker.
Oh, okay.
They're the peacemaker. They forget themselves and everybody else. They crave harmony around them and they're people pleasers. Um, but they lose track of themselves and um yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because like I'm just like I'm emotion and
Hmm.
um driven by emotion.
Yeah.
And I guess like as an artist, that's basically what I'm
Hmm.
doing all the time. But it's like learning that my interpersonal conflicts shouldn't go straight to my art and not and bypass me
Yeah.
dealing with that person. And
Right.
it's like I could actually get to a point where I'm creating healthier art. And as my therapist
Mm.
says, are you expressing this to actually educate people? Or are you expressing
Mm.
this because this is unresolved conflict and you're just publicizing it?
Wow.
And I'm like,
Wow.
damn. And so, I mean, like, we may see a big shift in my work because I'm,
That's really cool.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's a lot.
that's
And
really
so,
cool.
yeah, like so much of it is just untangling and realizing I didn't know I do that. And
Yeah.
it's been such a journey of like, I don't know I do that and realize, like
Hmm.
anytime I'm ever hurtful to someone, it's because
Hmm.
I think they're doing something hurtful to someone else. Otherwise, I don't care.
Mm.
If someone's
Right.
hurtful toward me, I'm have a hard
Mm.
time actually standing up for myself because it just feels selfish.
Mm.
And I think
Okay.
I don't know if it's like religious training of like deny yourself. And it's like I've been denying
Right.
myself for a very long time. But I
I was
think
going to
that
say that sounds like your evangelical life.
yeah. And so it's
Yeah.
like finding that like kind of potential that's there because I think that there is power
Hmm.
and it's something that I haven't wanted. And now I'm realizing, well, I could use that power to make the world a
Mm.
better place. And so I do need to take care of myself so that I'm actually of use.
Good. That's beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm not even sure what I'm going to title this. I wanted to talk about feminism and witchcraft, but it kind of and
We
it's
did a little
also
bit of everything.
it's Women's History Month too. I just like it's funny. I
Mm.
was realizing this morning, and then as we were talking, I'm realizing, oh well, we kind of touched on feminism, and it's like Women's History Month. I, you know,
Are you gonna go
I
ahead?
th- I think there is a special type of wisdom that's in the feminine, and
Of
I
course.
really value that. And I think that
Hmm.
the men who do not value that are
Hmm.
missing a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, they really are.
And I really
Yep.
believe this is true of cis women and trans women. I think trans women carry
Hmm.
that same wisdom too. And it's
For
that
sure.
alone, I'm like, wow. I'm like, this
Yeah.
this this is real. And
Yeah. Hmm.
and so I think maybe the kind of the gist of this is like if you are always doing these witch hunts, it's like our society is missing out on a lot because the feminine
Yep.
is vital.
Oh, yeah. The feminine is life. I
Yeah.
mean, life comes from the feminine. The feminine gives
Yeah.
birth to life. Yeah.
Well, happy Women's Month. What is it? Women's History Month? I think it's women's. I said it right the first time, didn't I?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
think I
happy
sounded
Monday.
smarter when I said it before.
You're funny.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I love coming on your podcast.
I love having you on.
Yeah, thank you. I
I'll add
appreciate
like
you.
a link to the Twitter and
Okay.
your coaching page too, right?
Yes, thank you. Lovemaven.ca. Yeah,
Yes. Love the name.
me too.
Okay. Bye.
That was awesome.
Air smudge.